Okay, thanks for having me. See if this thing works for me. So we have a laser pointer. Yeah. Okay. And to go forward, I guess it's this button here. Is it the one on the right? There we go. Oh. Okay. Okay, so you've probably seen this figure before. Last year was the warmest year globally since we've been keeping track. And temperatures in Utah have been warming as well. This is a plot of mean annual temperature in the state over the past 120 years. And two things to notice. First, there's a ton of variation from year to year, and that's going to be an important point of my talk. But there's definitely a trend in the past several decades of increasing temperatures year after year. And all the climate models suggest that we're going to continue experiencing increases like this for decades to come. And this really begs the question, how are the plants and the animals that we care about going to respond to this kind of change? So today I'm going to be asking that question about big sagebrush, Artemisia tridentata, which is an aromatic shrub full of terpenes, like Curtis was talking about, different ones. And it's found over millions of hectares of the western United States. And where it occurs, it's a very important part of the ecology, as many of you know. It's habitat for endemic species such as the greater sage-grouse. And more than that, it's an iconic part of the western landscape. So right here on USU's campus, we actually have a new sagebrush garden. And so you can walk out this building, take a right, and walk all the way down the path. And in front of the new USU Credit Union building, there's a sagebrush garden. And it's not enough that we just plant sagebrush at USU. We actually have to sing about it as well. And so this is the Scotsman, which is the song that students sing at the USU football and basketball games. And the last line is, "Show me a true-blooded Aggie from Utah who doesn't love the spot where the sagebrush grows." So, where is sagebrush going to grow in the future, given climate change? Well, that's where the science comes in, right? And the way that we've approached this so far is by using a technique called species distribution modeling, which is fantastic. And here's a result for sagebrush from a recent paper. And the thing to notice here is these big red areas in the map are showing areas where this model projects that sagebrush will lose habitat due to climate change. The gray areas are areas where sagebrush could persist in the future, and the blue area up in the north in Montana is areas that may become more suitable for sagebrush in the future. And this technique has a lot of advantages, or is very useful. But the thing about it is it's based on a static map of where the species occurs, and then it uses that to project where it could occur in the future. And so the surprising thing for people that don't really know much about these models is that they actually don't include any data on how species have responded to climate change. This is a projection totally based on sort of a spatial analysis. So we wanted to take a different approach and look for clues as to how sagebrush could respond to temperatures in the future based on how it has responded to temperature in the past. So the idea here is if we have a time series of sagebrush abundance over time, as in this upper panel here, it's fluctuating up and down. We want to know, well, why is it that it went up in some years, and why is it that sagebrush abundance went down in other years? And is it related to the lower figure, which is the mean annual temperature of that site, right? So what we're going to do as ecologists is think about this as a sort of a population ecology question. And we're going to ask, how does the population growth rate of sagebrush, shown here on the y-axis of this plot on the right, how is it affected by annual temperature anomaly, deviations from that average temperature, which is shown on the x-axis? And if we find that population growth rates tend to be positive, in some years that are associated with positive temperature anomalies, and we find that population growth rates are negative in years that are associated with negative temperature anomalies, then that would say, well, sagebrush has this positive sloping response to temperature. It's going to increase in abundance in response to warmer temperatures. So we can do this for a single site, but this isn't going to help us if we're really interested in the totality of sagebrush's response to climate change across half the continent. So to do that, we needed lots of data. And so I inquired about sagebrush data from land management agencies across the West, and I asked researchers who work in the West for any data they had on sagebrush abundance over time. And I was able to dig up 19 different data sets that report sagebrush abundance from permanent transects or plots. And all the data that you'll see in this analysis comes from these folks, and none of it's my own, so it's all a credit to other people's data and people sharing their data. And I don't know if anybody's here, but I want to thank Jim Long and Layla Schultz too. They provided some Camp Williams data, so if either of them are here, thanks for that. And Sage Step too also provided a ton of data, so if there's Sage Step folks here, that was great. So this is where we got the data from. These are sites. Each dot is a site that we got data from. The size of the dot is just showing how much data we got from that site. And the important take home here is that we got data from sites that span the entire range of sagebrush, which is shown as the gray area in the background. So we're kind of covering the range pretty well. And in total, we had almost 8,000 year-to-year transitions in sagebrush to model. And then for each one of these sites that you see on the map, we extracted monthly temperature and monthly precipitation data from PRISM and DAMET climate data sets. So just to give you an example, what the actual data looked like, here's data from one permanent transect somewhere in this data set, and it's just showing sagebrush cover fluctuating over time. And so the point here is that each point on this figure is somewhere where someone had to go out and measure sagebrush year after year. Either they were working for the national parks or they were working for some other project. So we focused on looking at how sagebrush was going to respond to temperature at two different windows within the annual seasons that we thought would be important for sagebrush growth. So if you imagine sagebrush growing between these dashed lines from a 12-month period, a 1-year change in growth, we were going to focus on the spring temperature, which is the average of the months right before you measure sagebrush, which is usually in the summer. And then this lag temperature variable, which is shown with the red boxes, which is the average of the past 3 growing seasons. Okay? So we're going to be modeling how sagebrush responds to those 2 variables. We also looked at some precipitation variables, but I'm not going to go into too much detail there. And we put this together in a simple population model, which is very convenient because it looks like a standard linear regression. And I won't bore you with the details here too much, except that the response variable is your cover of sagebrush at your current year, and your predictor variables is the sagebrush cover of the previous year, which is y(t-1), and then all the climate effects. Okay, so let's get to the results. So what we found here is, first to orient you to these graphs, we're going to be plotting the effect of warmer temperatures on sagebrush population growth rates on the y-axis. So the y-axis is saying, did sagebrush population, how did they change in response to a 1 degree temperature increase in, a 1 degree increase in temperature. And on the x-axis, I'm going to be plotting the mean annual temperature of each of those sites that we got data from, okay? So points above that dashed line, positive, in the positive range, show increases in sagebrush cover, and points below show decreases in sagebrush cover. So our first result here is the most important in the talk, and it just shows that when we increase that lag temperature variable by 1 degree Celsius, we tend to see a positive response of sagebrush growth at colder sites. So if you go to the left side of that figure, you'll see that that line, that black line with the gray confidence band around it, is positive. So at cold sites, sagebrush likes warmer than average temperatures, whereas at warm sites, sagebrush is actually declining a little bit in response to warmer than average temperatures. We can make a similar plot for the effect of the other temperature variable in the analysis, which was spring temperature, and we see that it's not as sensitive to that spring temperature variable. So one cool thing we can do is also look at different subspecies. So if you know sagebrush, you know it has a variety of subspecies that are ecologically distinct. On the left is mountain sagebrush, which grows at higher elevations that are wetter, and Wyoming sagebrush is on the right, and that grows in really dry conditions. And what you're seeing here is that mountain sagebrush is very responsive to temperature, to that temperature increase, and it tends to be a positive effect in most sites. Wyoming sagebrush, on the other hand, is not very responsive to this increase in temperature. And that kind of makes sense because mountain sagebrush is growing in sites where it may be experiencing quite a lot of snow and cold temperatures. Okay, so putting both of those temperature variables together, we can look at, we can actually make a prediction for how the overall cover might change in response to 2 degrees Celsius warming, which is kind of in the mid-range of what we might expect in the region. And what you see is in line with what I showed you earlier. Sagebrush could increase in colder sites, and it could decrease in warmer sites. And the gray bars here are 95% confidence intervals. So it's just showing that, while there's a trend here, we don't have a lot of confidence for projecting sagebrush cover changes at any one site. There's a lot of variability. And we can kind of divide this figure up into areas where you get positive changes in sagebrush and negative. And in general, this kind of aligns with what we think about with this figure. So the red areas might be found here on the right side of that graph. One more. Okay, so what's going on here? Is this believable ecologically? One thing I just want to point out is that there's been some nice work from Rocky Mountain Biological Lab showing that experimentally causing earlier snowmelt actually does seem to benefit sagebrush in that site quite a lot. So there's some nice experimental work that verifies that sagebrush could respond positively to warmer temperatures in cold, snowy conditions. On the other hand, why is sagebrush potentially going to decline in hot sites in response to warmer than average temperatures? That's a little harder to explain, and it could be, one idea is that it's due to increased drought stress that those warmer temperatures are going to induce, more soil drying and more vapor pressure deficit. Okay. Oh. So, taken together, I think our result here, looking at the dynamic response of sagebrush to these fluctuations in temperature, alongside a static approach based on species distribution models, I think taken together, we should have more confidence that sagebrush will respond to climate change in the future, and that it probably, possibly, will shift in distribution in the future as well, away from these warmer areas and towards potentially colder areas. So, also, if you want to hear a lot more about this, my advisor is going to be talking about comparing 3 different modeling approaches to assess sagebrush vulnerability to climate change at 3:30. So, a little bit more in depth on this question. I want to thank everybody who helped with this project, especially everyone who contributed their long-term data to me and funding. Thank you.
You basically cover values are measuring, could be measuring variability in growth in a particular year at the same individuals that have been there persisting over time.
Yeah.
At the same time, you're using a population model and kind of a population approach. How might you think the difference between just how well a sagebrush or how much growth a sagebrush plant experiences in any given year versus the bottleneck that occurs when you have to reestablish?
Yeah, that's a great point. I definitely glossed over that. So yeah, the question is kind of, I'm accounting for these changes in these short-term changes in cover that are mostly due to changes in sagebrush size. But what's also needs to be taken into account is, can sagebrush regenerate in warmer temperatures, and how are individuals going to survive? And I think that's not covered in this, and there's that's something that you can. We do have a model in the talk later this afternoon that looks at regeneration, but that's a great point. So fire comes through. If fire intervals increase and regeneration is worse in the future, sagebrush could be impacted by that as well. So I think of this analysis as kind of a baseline, assuming there were no fire and there wasn't a lot of disturbance. What are the kind of short-term changes we could see?